All right, so yes, short session today, unless some of you have some surprises for me that I'm not aware of. We're covering two parts today that are somewhat related, but I'm going to talk about them distinctly, setup and security. So what we're talking about in terms of setup are just general improvements to how we manage the setup pages in our software. This would be different from any of the individual sessions we've had where we might want to change how some of those things work, like the session on views or the session on data structure and so on. This is just sort of a general overview of how we do our software setup areas. And the second part is about our security. And we've already done some pretty substantial work on the security in the software over the past year to 2 years, most of it in the past year or so. So I'll talk a little bit about that and what we think is still left on our list, and then I'll open it up for comments. But we should be through it lickety-split. Okay, here we go. So there are two major things that we're looking at when we're talking about this general setup area review, and that is first, the ease of use of the setup screens, and second, whether we need some additional setup and configuration options. And again, some of those have been covered in other sessions where we talked about, changes to the views and so on, or whatever, whatever setup we're going to be talking about, like our classification systems that we have this Friday. Certainly any changes we make to how classification systems work would be reflected in those setup areas. This is more general than that. So here are a few things.
Kate, I'm sorry, just interrupt for a sec. Are you taping this?
I am.
Okay, good. Okay, thanks.
Sorry, yeah, I usually say I'm starting the recording.
Usually say it, yeah.
I started the recording, it's all good. Okay. So here are some of the things we are aware of. Number one is we need more overview reports. In particular, we have a few of the setup areas where people are accumulating some really large lists of setup items. So many, many views, many, many templates, many, many publications. I can go on and on, to the point where it's getting really difficult to manage those items and to figure out who created them, what are they for, what is public, what is not public. Really hard to get an overall sense of what's going on. And although we do have some overview reports for some of these items, for instance, we have overview reports for publications that will allow you to produce a full list of all your publications, easily see which ones are public and not. We don't have that for a number of items, and that makes it really difficult to properly manage those items, especially to monitor the security and access of those items, where people can become unsure of what is public and what is not. And that makes it hard to, as I say, hard to really manage the security of it and know that you're maintaining it properly. Hard to clean up after yourself if you no longer need an item. You don't know, is anyone still using this? Who created it in the first place? What was the point? So having an easier ability to get a sense of the list as a whole and what each thing is used for would be incredibly helpful to that end. And one of the things we discussed in a previous session was for things that aren't owned by a particular, or that are owned by another agency, in some cases we need to allow visibility to others so they at least know those items exist, even if they can't make modifications or get access to any private information. Let's take a list of views, for example. They still need to know that there are another 20 views that are all owned by this other agency, which ones are public and which ones are not. It's still important to the overall security of the database that all the super users are aware of what exists, how it's being used, what's public, what's not. Next item, and this is an ease of use item, where it's appropriate, which is not everywhere, that we not require individual submissions of each line item when setup items are presented in a list. I'm going to try and clarify that. So I'm going to go to the current field display setup for an example, although we're rewriting this page anyway, so keep that in mind. It won't be like this anyway as of the next release. So the idea here being, I currently, if I want to change the name or change the order of these fields, I have to do them one at a time. I have to update each individual line one at a time. And most of you will have noticed that in many areas of the software where we have been updating the pages, we've stopped making you do the update one at a time. So we've started to instead take the approach of updating the whole list, allowing you to make multiple changes at once. Now, in some kinds of setup, it actually doesn't make sense for you to make multiple changes at the same time, and it introduces the potential for accidental problems. So it has to be considered on a case-by-case basis. But in cases like this, where if you're changing the order, you probably want to change the order of a number of things at the same time, having to do them one at a time is really obnoxious. So we'd like to move away from that model in the areas that we haven't done so yet. Next, sorting selected items to the top to make it easier to see what is and isn't included. An example of this, first of all, I'll give this example. So we have in the field, I can't easily see which fields I'm using and which I'm not in the database. It would be nice to have all the fields I don't use out of my way so that I can really clearly see what's in use and what's not. That's actually going to change with the next release anyway in this case. I'm going to give an example of what we would like to do instead, and that is I'll go into the Excel profiles. So instead, we would like to move to the model that we've implemented for the Excel profiles and also for the CIC field setup, and that is to put anything that's in use towards the top. So it's really easy to distinguish the things I'm using versus the things I'm not using. So you don't have to scroll down giant lists of items in order to pick out the ones that you've included. It will put everything you've included at the top, so I can really easily see this is what's in my report. Everything below is not in my report. That's the model we would like to have everywhere. It just makes it a lot easier to manage. It's too easy when you're scrolling through a list of hundreds of items to miss one thing that you've added or one thing that you've left out that you wanted to add. Whereas if we organize it in this way, it's very clear what is and isn't in your list. We would like to have an alerts page to indicate if important setup items aren't properly completed. So this alert page would be for the super user, who at any time could go to their alerts page and have flags for them if anything appeared to be not set up in an effective way or appeared to have potentially some missing information. The logical response here is, well, why aren't those things required in the first place? And the issue is that in many of these cases, we can't really require those items for various reasons. They're only needed under certain conditions, or when we first set up your database, we don't have that information, so we can't provide it right away, so we can't require it. And you may have to make sure that it's filled out before you actually bring your database public, just as an example. So we can't require it, and that means we have to have some other way of letting you know that certain things haven't been done in the most effective way. In some cases, it might be a case of best practices. It's not an absolute requirement, but the way that something is set up is not the way that we would recommend that it be set up. And some of those things we can figure out automatically and at least let the super user know if there are some concerns like that, such that they can review that list and determine what is and isn't a problem and make some decisions about that. With so many setup items, hundreds and hundreds, thousands really, of different setup items throughout the database, it can be really hard for a super user to keep track of whether everything has been done correctly. Okay, the last item comes back to these, yes, we have hundreds and thousands of setup items. The ability to hide certain kinds of setup items that simply are not relevant to the member and never will be relevant to the member. So our first example would be the hundreds of fields that we have and the fact that some of those fields will never be relevant to certain types of members because they're really used in different service areas. So a regular community information provider providing a basic INR service might never use the business fields, and so It would be nice if they had the potential to indicate that they don't plan to use the business fields and have those sort of hidden away whenever they're making their view setup or doing other things and not being presented with gigantic lists of hundreds of items that they'll never use. Another example might be some of the checklists or other setup items that they simply don't plan on using. If there was a way to hide those items, with the option obviously to come back and if you changed your mind over time and needed them again to restore them, but the option to hide some items that really aren't relevant to the day-to-day work of each individual member will make the setup areas less overwhelming for people because they won't have to crawl through many setup items that have nothing to do with their day-to-day work. Okay, are there any questions about setup, other kinds of suggestions about setup that anyone would like to hit on now before I go to the section on security? Okay. So, part 2, security. As I mentioned, we've already done quite a significant amount in improving the security of the database over the past 1 to 2 years. Some of the changes we've done is a more secure login process, both the process itself in how your login is stored and checked, how your passwords are stored, but also implementing SSL or a secure connection for when you enter your password. Many changes like that to try and improve the security of the login process. We've also added many different kinds of historical information about changes that are made. So many types of our setup items that didn't used to have any information about who made the last change, we've added that information to every table. So even the ones where you can't see a historical information about who made the change, behind the scenes we're storing that information so that if there was any kind of an issue and someone said, you know, oh, this has been changed, I didn't do this, we can go in behind the scenes and look at what happened and see, you know, who made that last change, and there's some accountability there about what was done, and that's very helpful, especially for us when people think that something happened in a software upgrade or something else. When we can go back and say, no, you know, we can see that this person went in at this time on this day and they made this change. It's very helpful for accountability. In a couple of cases, we've added really extensive history systems, and that is within our community information records, where we have now a full back history of all the exact changes made to each field and who made them, which is kept over a long term. So not just the last change made, but every change made and the exact details of what was changed. So we can say not only was this record modified on Tuesday, but these are the fields that were modified, and this is the exact changes that they made to those fields. It introduces a really high level of accountability in terms of who is making the changes. It also means that we open up all kinds of reporting capacities that we never had access to before. Makes it possible for us to better detect the types of modifications that are made, such that if we do things like automated imports and exports, we can tell whether the changes that were made to a record are relevant to that particular import-export process. So there's lots of benefits to that. And also, we've done a history system on the user accounts. So every time a new account is created, every time an account is updated, given a new user type, password change, login name change, anything like that, we have a record of that happening and who made that change. So again, it's an accountability thing that you can easily see how those things were changed over time. And there have been quite a number of other security changes. Those are some of the major ones. There was a very big push a year ago to try and do as many of our outstanding security issues and wishes. So we have covered quite a lot already and come a long way in the past year. But we still have a pretty big list of would-be nice items, so I'll go through those now. Number one, we've already started down this path, and we want to keep going. Creating more individual permissions that are not tied to super user status. So an issue that we were running into over and over again is people were granting super user access because they needed some very minor permission that you had to be a super user in order to do. And it really isn't appropriate to make, half the users in your database be a super user. So what we need to do instead is break out as many as possible of these small permissions so that people can be selective about exactly what they want each individual kind of user to do, instead of just blanket granting super user access across the board to make sure that they have permissions that they need. A lot of this work has already taken place, but there are certainly still some areas where some of our members want to grant access to certain parts of the software that other members wouldn't do unless you're a super user. So by breaking them out as individual components, we give each member the power to make decisions about what each kind of user can do in terms of their own comfort and their own, the way they operate in their organization in terms of authority. So I think there's still room to make more individual permissions. It does make the setup a little bit more complicated when you create your user types, when you have to individually consider each kind of operation that you're allowing them to do. But because that's not a setup item that you change all the time, it shouldn't be too much of a burden. And it does mean that, again, we don't open the security hole of giving too many users super user authority when they really shouldn't have it. Next item, we would like to keep a log of both successful and attempted logins. So this would probably be over a particular period of time. The idea being you could tell if someone was trying to get in with your account and it wasn't you. Many of you who use government sites like the CRA's My Account or something similar will notice that it tells you the last time there was a login and where it was and when it was, which gives you an opportunity to notice whether that was you that logged in at that time. So something similar to that, and potentially flagging to a user if there have been multiple unsuccessful attempts to log in with their account. And it actually falls into something we have on the next slide here, which is account locking if there are too many unsuccessful attempts at logging in with a particular account. So that's a related item. I mentioned this in the export session and also I think in the view session. This is an important one to me, that we have better control over access to export profiles. And part of that is removing the old the old export formats that don't have a field access list, which would mean an export profile. So we have a few ancient formats that export pretty much everything in the database, not any of the newer fields, but basically everything. And right now, if you give someone export permission, they automatically get access to those formats that have all the fields in them that don't protect privacy profiles, that don't have field access lists. So it really is a security issue to not have better control over what is exported and by whom. We've already done view-based permissions on Excel profiles, on print profiles, so it really needs to expand out to export profiles as well, because until we do that, you really can't grant export permission to very many people, not responsibly anyway, because you're giving them access to more than what you probably want to give them access to at the moment. This is another one that came up in our session on views, the creation of access lists to public views based on domain name. This issue is coming up, has come up recently because of merged databases where they don't want another area's views to come up under the domain name of a different area, just that it might confuse the public and gives a sort of mixed or wrong message. But this could also happen in the case of a third-party client's view, where it might bring up your regular public site or something like that. So the idea here being that not only would a view be public or not public, but based on the address that they're using to access the site, you would say they can only show very particular views from that domain name. And that prevents Durham.cioc.ca from displaying York.cioc or Yorkinfo.cioc.ca or vice versa, which can be quite misleading. Okay. The ability for a user to allow the user permission to work under more than one agency and edit in more than one view. This is a more recent issue in part because of mergers and such, where there's a little bit more cooperation going on across sort of geography and between agencies to do some shared management. And there are two issues here. One is that even as a super user, unless it's set up that you can edit everything in your view, you still may only be able to do some kinds of management just on your own agency, whereas you in reality may need permission to edit more than one agency's records. So the idea here being, if my agency is ABC and I also have permission to edit records for ABD, then you would be able to tick off several additional agencies for which you have management privileges. And that would potentially cross into setup items and other things, basically allowing you to operate under more than one agency. You have a primary agency you're assigned to, and you have one or more secondary agencies that you are allowed to work with, their items. Connected to that is the ability to edit in more than one view. Right now, you may have access to 10 different views, but you can only update records in the one that you see when you first log on. This is to keep security tight because it gives some kind of control over what people can actually manage. They may be able to view other things, but that doesn't necessarily mean they should update. The issue is it really forces people into having a default view that has more in it than they would necessarily want. So people create these mega views with potentially tens of thousands of records in it, and they have to make that their default view in order to be able to work with all of those records. What would potentially be more helpful is the ability for them to have their default view be practically the one that they really need to work in most of the time, but also give them permission to switch to that mega view or to switch to some other view that has additional records that they work in on occasion and still have the ability to edit in that other view, even though it's not their default. So it still wouldn't be a blanket, oh, you can edit in every view you can see. It would still likely be done in a very controlled manner. So you would have to individually pick the other views that person could work in order to keep the security tight around that model. But it would certainly make life easier for people who have really large data sets where they do need to occasionally do some management in other areas, but want to be able to work in a view that is more relevant to them the majority of the time. Okay, I talked about the fact that we have put in sort of the created by, the last modified by on basically everything in the database, but that's just the last modification. So in some cases, we would like to expand our revision history to other kinds of items so that not only do we know who the last person was that did something, but we have some kind of ongoing history about the changes that were made. Now, it's not likely that that will be as detailed as it is for our community information records or for our users, because keeping track of the individual changes of every field of every setup item would be a tremendous burden. But having a basic update history of each time that was updated and who updated it is potentially very useful for some accountability of who is making changes. So this would be, I guess, a balance between keeping that ongoing history, but not probably in 99% of cases not going to the full extent that we're going with the user management or the CIC record of keeping like complete and total details of every little change that's made. The one area that's particularly important and challenging here is around deletion, because although we keep quite a good reference of when things were updated and created, in many cases you can't tell who deleted the item, and usually when there's some panic about something that got deleted, the only way to find out what happened is for them to contact us and us to actually crawl through the web logs and find out who accessed the deletion page. And all we can do then is make a guess based on IP address and some other bits of information about who did the deletion. So having some kind of history of deletions would also be very beneficial in terms of accountability. This last one is a tricky one because I have a note here that says may tie into multi-member database model. We have in a couple of instances allowed agencies to own setup items. In particular, this happened in views and in templates. The issue with this is it's really the multi-member database model that is supposed to be accounting for this type of separation. And it doesn't make sense to try and implement what the multi-member database model is doing in terms of separating people's setup areas out within a non-separated database when we already have plans to allow that type of separation as a benefit of the multi-member database model. So this particular item has to be done with some serious consideration of where this is reasonable and practical in terms of letting a particular agency own a publication code, let's say, or letting a particular agency own a checklist item. So it may be reasonable for us to say it really makes sense to allow agencies to own a publication and only that agency be able to update that publication and only that agency be able to add or remove that publication. That makes sense even outside the multi-member database model. But if we get down to I want my own general setup options and I want my own checklist items, I want my own local thesaurus terms, I want my own local taxonomy terms, and that is something that we really can't offer except in a multi-member database model. So although this may be desired in many areas, it's likely that we have to figure out where to draw the line between the multi-member database features that people can only have if they take a multi-member database model versus a case like publications where there's a very good argument that even outside of the multi-member database model, it makes sense for some of the small agencies to be able to own a publication code because it keeps them better under control and it really is a private setup item. Okay, so here's a few more. We talked about adding SSL to the database, which is if you log into the database using a CIOC.ca name, you'll notice it says HTTPS, and you get that lovely little lock telling you that it's a secure login page. So we would like to expand the ability to work in SSL. Right now it's only available from the login and account pages, and allow that to be throughout the software or other pages of the software, particularly adding to the volunteer profiles where they have their own login pages and it's not available there at this time, public update pages, other pages where there's potentially private information going back and forth, whether that be login or otherwise, you have the capacity to do that with a secure connection. Understanding that if you want to work with a secure connection, it's only set up for a CIOC.ca name at this time, not any other kind of domain name. The challenge with this is it is dependent on our ability to allow other kinds of files like images, style sheets, JavaScript files, and so on that might be in your template to be hosted also with a secure domain. Now, whether that be your secure domain or CIOC secure domain, it can potentially cause the browser to give misleading alerts about insecurity on the page because of having an insecure image on a page where which is designated as secure. So, Kristen, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. So some things you might think are not necessarily a security concern in that regard, like images. But for instance, you can use if someone is able to intercept the connection for your CSS for your page, they can make your page look incorrect and therefore simulate everything being okay when it's not. So it's not necessarily spurious warnings in that there is some slight risk of a security problem there, but it's important, and that's why they have these errors, that if you're in SSL, that everything be in SSL. And if your hosting for your remote files works with SSL already, it's actually a fairly easy fix for us to allow you to have those files available in SSL. So that would be a minor change. For people who don't have SSL with their hosting, it's potentially more expense than they are willing to bear.
Yes,
and
it
so
can be thousands of dollars to get.
It won't, in this particular case, it won't be because it'll be a single.
Yeah,
So
I said it can potentially be, depending on your needs, it can potentially be thousands of dollars to set up a multi-year certificate. So it can be a significant expense to have that set up. But the point being, it doesn't matter where the SSL is, whether it be your SSL or our SSL, that is one of the barriers to moving forward with having a fully secured site. We've discussed this next item in the section on volunteer profiles, and that is having other sign-in mechanisms, such as OpenID, that allow you to get authentication through a third party. And Chris, you go ahead and
so,
give 2 cents on that.
Basically, if someone else can do the authentication for us, and there are secure methods of doing this, OpenID is an available standard that we can build against that works with people's already existing Google, Yahoo, Facebook, Twitter logins. And there's also, if you want to run an OpenID server for your users, or there's the other OpenID servers available, then we can offload some of the more sensitive portions of the authentication to people who specialize in that. And I mean, you don't have to look very far to find security breaches based on, oh, I logged into this thing for comments, and now someone's hacked into that, and they have my password, and because my password on this site is not the same as the password on another site, well, now they can follow the chain of, this is my email, and I've got a password, so I can log in there. One of the more high-profile ones that happened recently was the Gawker media sites had a failure of that kind, where their password database was discovered. And when a large disclosure like that happens, places like Google and Yahoo and Facebook check to see if people have the same email and password and proactively alert them to that. So that's something that we don't have the ability to do. So if you are sharing emails between, sharing passwords between multiple accounts, if a security breach happens on another site, we don't have the capacity to be able to tell you about that. But if we were using something like OpenID, then security is what they're going for, and so that is their business, and that is, you know,
we assume they know better than us.
We like to, yes. In terms of security, if you can defer to someone with more skill in that area, you're really good doing it, because where security is involved, it's really easy to make a small mistake that gives up everything.
So this, I think, particularly comes in for the volunteer profile. So where there's public login, where the idea of logging into Facebook or Twitter or something else first seems less strange. I think a lot of our members would think it a little bit weird to be logging into Twitter in order to get into their CIOC account. So, you know, it may not be applicable for all the types of logins in our database, but for those who are using public services, we're just yet another public service to them, the same way that their Facebook account is or their Yahoo account is. And so tying it together in those cases may be very helpful to those users in particular. So we talked about account locking. Won't go there again. One of the things we have for volunteer profiles that we don't have anywhere else is the ability to do some kind of an account recovery if you forget your password. Keeping in mind that even Chris and I can't retrieve your password for you. It's not stored anywhere that isn't encrypted at all. So if you forget your password, the only way to do something about it is to reset it. It cannot be retrieved at all by anyone. So what we're talking about here is not a password retrieval of your existing password. We're talking about a reset process by which a user is sent a link, an expiring link, to be able to do a reset of their account, to provide a new password and start again. That is a feature that we offer for volunteer profiles because we don't want our volunteer center members to have to be managing the accounts of the public, but we don't have an equivalent for our staff accounts. And so at this point, if someone forgets their password, they have to contact their local super user in order to get a reset. And in the worst case, if the super user forgets their password, which happens, officially speaking, CIOC doesn't want to reset your password if you forget it. So you have to actually jump through quite a lot of hoops if you're a super user that forgets your password and you don't have another super user who can reset it for you, because we have to go through some serious authentication processes to ensure that we can legitimately reset your password for you, and it's not something we like to do. So having this capacity built in will hopefully reduce issues that can occur when people do forget their passwords. Now that said, this would be an optional feature because not every member or every agency would necessarily be comfortable with users being able to do their own password retrieval. So this would be something that probably each individual agency could activate or inactivate about whether their users would be able to initiate their own password reset process.
So that would be a feature that would probably be built into a third-party login system, OpenID, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, Twitter. So that's another reason to want to use an external system because, again, that's what they do. So therefore, they have those kinds of features built in. Actually, all the remaining feature things on this page would be potentially features that an external authentication system would have.
And finally, timed password expiry. And this is a contentious one because usually users will just go and change their password to something else and then go in and change it back to what it was before. This is not necessarily...
I don't necessarily believe that a timed password expiry is actually a good security measure because, and there's much debate in the security community about whether it is or it isn't, because it tends to be unrealistic for the vast majority of people. Instead of having a collection of couple of strong passwords, they have to keep coming up and remembering new passwords. what ends up happening is that they end up having either less secure passwords that they can remember, or they end up having Post-it notes on their monitor with passwords on it.
Writing it down.
Which is that's a big...
Or saving it in Notepad, or, something where basically they've completely lost all security in order for them to try and remember the password that they have to change every month or every 3 months. That said, it's on this list because it's been requested by a member. So when our members have requirements, we have to obviously seriously consider those requirements and the reasons why they might have that type of a requirement. Our personal recommendation is that this is not an effective security measure, and we wouldn't particularly recommend it, but we do understand that that may be an internal security requirement that some of our members have. So that's why it needs to be considered. And there's a question. One moment. Oh, Sharon is saying, yeah, that if she had to keep changing her password, it would be frustrating. Yes,
so,
that kind of thing drives me bonkers. When I worked at the library, that happened every month, and the Post-it note was completely what happened. The staff computer had Post-it note of the password right on the monitor in the staff room because nobody could remember what this month's password was.
And if you're someone who's struggling with the I have too many passwords problem, my recommendation is a service called LastPass, which is an incredibly secure password management service where they do not have access to your passwords, but which will allow you to have an actual separate password for every site that you go to, and then you can maintain one really strong password for remembering all of the other passwords.
Yeah, so that's LastPass, P-A-S-S. So for anyone who's interested in that kind of a service. All right, so that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to unmute everyone, and if anyone has any questions, comments, etc., we'll try and get those on the record. So again, if you don't want to speak, please unmute yourself because I'm going to unmute you. And if your mic doesn't work, just type in the questions area and I'll monitor it. All right, everyone is unmuted now, so feel free to ask any questions or give comments. Okay, we have a question. Suzanne was asking, LAST, L-A-S-T.
Why don't you bring up the website?
Oh, that's not what I meant to do. There we go. Hey, found it anyway. That's nice.
So it's LastPass because it's the last password you'll have to remember. But it works in basically every browser on every platform, and works on, you can get apps for your smartphone and that sort of thing. There was if you're interested in knowing how secure it is, Steve Gibson did a review of the security in LastPass and explained quite clearly what it is that they're doing to make sure that there's never a disclosure of your login information.
Cool. Well, Kate and Chris, if I can comment, at telehealth, I have two systems. One asks for the password every, I think, 3 months, and the other one's every 6 months. And it's a pain in the butt because I have to synchronize them both at the same time. Otherwise, I'll never remember them.
Yeah.
I think I have a list of about 6 on a little Post-it note right in front of me.
Yes,
just to know what the last one was.
So my answer on systems, do yourself a favor and do LastPass. It's totally free until you do some of the more crazy things. But even if you go for if you go for the paid version, it's like $12 or something like that, which is what you need in order to be able to use the app on your smartphone. We have a hand up.
Yeah, I think that was
cool.
Yeah, IRD.
Okay.
That one's cleared.
Okay.
So as I don't know if we want to go back to the setup slides, if anyone needs to sort of refresh their memory about what we were talking about there, or because there were two relatively distinct topics. I put them in together because they were both pretty short. So, and that if there aren't any comments, that's fine. As I said, I expected it to be a relatively brief session today. If no one does have any comments, then you can always sit back and digest the information and see if there's anything that you come up with later on, especially around the setup areas, anything that in terms of ease of use and so on that would potentially improve your life if we made some changes around that.
Okay, any other comments, folks? No? Well, then I guess Chris and Kate, thank you very much. And thank you very much, folks, for coming this afternoon on March break for our session.
Yes.
I guess we're done.
A reminder that Friday session is going to be an important one, but a very long one. I'm going to send out an alert explaining the order of the classification systems that we're going to do and giving people an opportunity to request an email before I start each topic in case they don't need to be there for all 4 topics. So be prepared and look out for that alert if you need to potentially hop in and out for the different types of classification systems that we'll be talking about on Friday. Okay? And next week is our general overview session as well for each module.